Are you interested in slow stitching, but you don't know any fancy embroidery stitches? Well, you don't need to. Join me today as I create this fabric collage and I use only one stitch, the straight stitch. This versatile stitch has endless variations and possibilities. I'm going to show all the supplies that I've used and demonstrate a technique to create clean edges on the base fabric. Then I'll create a collage using rounded shapes today, and then it'll be time for the stitching. So join me today. You can create texture, variation, and beauty with just one stitch. It's so relaxing and enjoyable. Let's get started. I'm starting with a piece of felt that's about 3 inches square. That's about 7.5 centimeters. And I have one piece of fabric. This is a thin cotton fabric, and it's bigger than my piece of felt on all sides by about 1/4 inch. And so that means that I have enough fabric to fold over on all sides. So what I'm going to be doing here is folding and making mitered corners. This is very similar to a binding method that quilters use, where they use their backing as their binding. I have some wonder clips that are going to help me as I stitch to hold this folded fabric in place. I use 2 different types of needles. I use embroidery needles and milliner's needles. These ones I'm using today are by Clover, and they're called gold eye because the eye of the needle is gold, and that helps when threading the needle. I'm going to be using 2 strands of the 6-stranded embroidery floss today. Either of these needles will work for this project. The main difference between the two is that the milliner's needles are 1 length throughout, and the embroidery needles are slightly bigger at the end where you thread it. So I have my first side folded over, and I'm going to hold it in place with a clip. And to keep this piece of fabric from shifting, I'm going to place a clip on the other end to hold everything in place. I'm going to come in the middle of this side. I've chosen a thread that matches my fabric. I'm not too concerned about whether my stitches go through all the way to the other side, because this is going to be covered up when I add my collage pieces. So I come in and take a straight stitch. I'm working on the top of the piece, meaning that I'm keeping my needle on the top, and I can stack up a few stitches and then pull my thread through. When I get to the corner, I'm going to fold it up once and then fold it again. This is very similar to the process of wrapping a present. I'm going to bring a clip in and clip that in place. So now I have a nice mitered corner there that I'm going to hold with my left hand, and then I'm going to take a few stitches to hold that corner piece down. And then I'm going to continue along my next side, taking straight stitches. I'm going to repeat this process for all of the remaining corners. So I come to my next corner, I fold my fabric up once and then twice so that it meets my felt, clip it in place, hold that corner with my thumb, stitch it down, and continue. After I've done my 4th corner, I work my way back to where I started, and I knot off. So now I have my square piece of fabric. I can see just one place actually where it came through to the other side. And again, I'm not worried about that because I'm going to be covering this up with collage. I have a nice square piece with nice clean edges. It's a nice way to start a collage, having the edges already folded under and sewn down. So now I'm going to bring out some fabrics. I'm going to be working with solid fabrics today, and I'm going to be making some shapes. So I have a few shades of blue and pink. The only plan I have for my collage is that I want to make rounded shapes. I wanted to do something different than some of the patchwork I've been doing, where I've been laying down solid and patterned fabrics that are mostly square or rectangular. And I've been completely covering the surface, overlapping each other, and making a patchwork. So I felt like doing something different and having some rounded shapes. And I may overlap them, but I don't want to completely cover up this nice yellow-green fabric that I'm starting with. I'm going to keep working this way, rounding out all the shapes, and it's going to create a different type of collage than what I've been making recently. So I'm taking this green, I'm going to make a longer oval shape here and find a spot that I like for that. And I'm going to keep adding and layering It's not always easy to freehand cut a rounded shape. So one option is to take an erasable pen or marker and sketch out the shape that you want to cut. So I'm doing that here with this blue piece. The other thing you can do is fold your piece of fabric in half and cut your rounded shape, and that's going to make it more even. I'm not overly concerned with having perfectly round shapes, but it does help me to get the shape that I'm looking for. So as I add new shapes, then it changes the way that the piece looks, and it means sometimes that you want to change the shape of another one that's already down. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to keep on cutting out these rounded shapes and placing them around until I get an arrangement that I'm really happy with. I've added in this sort of olive green color that I'm liking, so I'm going to look for another way to add some more of that in. I'm getting really close now, I think, to having the amount of collage that I'm looking for, where I have some interest happening with the pieces I've added, and there's still quite a bit of that yellow-green in my base fabric showing through. So here I think I've settled on a nice collage. I've added some more of that olive green color, and I'm at the spot where I have enough pieces on here now that I'm wanting to secure them down. So right now they're just sitting on the fabric, and I think I'm ready to say that they're going to stay where they are. So I have these really small applique pins, and they're the same as sewing pins, except they're smaller. And so they work well for these small collages. So I'm going to bring those out and pin my pieces of fabric in place so that I can then base them down. That's the method that I like using for my collages. You could also have fusible on the back of your fabric. My preferred way is to use the old-fashioned thread basting. So I have my pins in place. I'm bringing out just regular sewing thread. I'm using white. I've threaded that onto a needle, and I have a magnetic pin cushion nearby so that when I pull the pins out, I don't lose them. These pins are really small, and I'm always trying to keep track of them so that they don't end up on the floor or somewhere where myself or someone else can get poked. So the basting method that I use is taking small stitches on the front, 1 or 2 in each piece of fabric to secure them down, and I jump across on the back, so there's a large stitch on the back, small stitch on the front. So my basting stitches are barely visible on the front of my piece, and I like that because it's less distracting for me while I'm stitching. So I move across the piece and turn and go back, and I remove the pins as I go. Now that my collage pieces are basted in place, I'm going to choose threads that match. I have 2 trays of the 6-stranded embroidery floss in my collection. So I'm going to pull out my first tray, and I'm going to choose some colors that match the blues and the greens that I have. And what I'm looking for is a color that matches, and often a dark and a light version of that color that matches. And that gives me options when stitching. So here I have a lighter and a darker version. Sometimes you have more than one option. So what I'm looking for here are colors that are going to go with all of my blues and greens. And when I have 2 colors that are very close, you often can't go wrong, but I tend to choose just one that I'll use all over. So now I've chosen dark and light shades for my blues. I'm going to do the same thing for my pinks. So here I've chosen a pink that matches very closely with the pink that I have, and I've chosen a lighter shade. In here are my turquoise colors that I've chosen, and here's an olive color that matches that olive green. Here's the color that I did my binding with at the beginning. That's a fairly close match to that yellow-green color, so I'm keeping that as well to use. I may at some point choose even darker or lighter colors of all these shades, but I always have in front of me a black and a gray and a white and an off-white. So I may bring some of those shades into the piece as well. And now onto the versatile straight stitch. I'm going to continue to use just this one stitch throughout the piece, and the way I'm going to use the straight stitch now is to surround each piece of collage with stitching. I'm using this yellow-green color to stitch around the edges of this pink, and for each piece of collage I'm going to choose a different shade, a not matching shade, to surround it with straight stitches. Depending on the angle that I'm working at and the comfort in my hand, I either work on the top with these stitches or I go from the front to the back, pulling the thread all the way through. So either a stab stitch style or working right on the top. Both work for these straight stitches. So I'm going to finish stitching this pink piece, and I'm going to start surrounding all of these pieces with stitching in the same way. So here I've done a few more. I've added a light blue color on that green piece on the top. I've added the light pink color around that olive green. You can see these straight stitches are starting to add quite a bit of texture, and they add a really interesting touch. So I'm going to continue doing this, surrounding each piece. So I'm almost finished surrounding all my pieces. I have a few more stitches to take, and then I'm going to remove my basting stitches. So what I have left are some spots along the edges where I haven't stitched. So I'm going to stitch those down, and I'm going to continue to use the straight stitch. Normally I would do a blanket stitch on the edges, but here I'm committed to using only the straight stitch. So to do this on the edge, I'm going to come through from the back, and I'm going to wrap the thread towards the back and come through with another stitch. So these are still straight stitches. What I'm doing here is helping direct where they're going because they're on an edge. So when I'm finished on that edge, I'm going to knot off. I'm going to do the same thing over on the right hand side. That tall light blue piece, I need to do the same thing. And I had run out of thread previously, and I had started to do it, so I'm going to come back in on this bottom edge and do the same thing. Where I'm coming from the back, I'm wrapping it around and taking a stitch right beside. So I have another spot where I'm going to do this along the edge. So this is my last step, is to do this around all the pieces that touch the edge. And now I'm going to remove my basting stitches. I've made some clips on the back, and I'm using the dull side of my needle to pull those stitches out on the front. Sometimes these basting stitches will get covered up and tightened down by the stitching, so it helps if I do a lot of clipping and pull them out. So now my basting stitches are out, and I'm ready to add some decorative stitching, again, just using straight stitches. I've made some progress, beginning some decorative stitching. I've placed straight stitches in groups, and that's made some really interesting marks. I've also made some crosses or plus signs with my stitches. Again, these are just straight stitches, one in one direction, one in the other direction over top of the first one. And I've made some small circles, and these are straight stitches taken very close to each other. I've also stitched a circle in my dark pink color, and these are often thought of as a satin stitch, which are really just straight stitches placed close together. So there are a variety of straight stitches that I've done on this piece, and you can see they all give really different effects. And these small circles that I've stitched in this darker blue color are standing out because they're so much darker, and I'm liking the contrast that that's giving. So I'm going to add some more stitching using that same color. And here you can see I've added some at the top on the right, some straight stitches in groups, and just under those plus signs, I've added some more. So now I want to add lines of straight stitching. And this is something that's very recognizable as slow stitching, often called the running stitch, where it's one stitch that goes in and out, in and out, in and out in a straight line. I think you could choose to do these running stitches, these straight line stitches, in either black or white here. Either would be a really nice contrast. I'm going to choose white today, and I'm going to make these stitches horizontally. They could also be made vertically. You really can't go wrong here. I've done quite a few of straight stitching in vertical lines already in the background, so I thought it would be nice to add these stitches horizontally for some contrast. So instead of starting at the top or the bottom, I'm going to start towards the top, about a third of a way down from the top, taking one straight stitch, and then I'm coming back a distance away, and I'm going to go horizontally all across the piece. Now you could do a stab stitch here where you're going from the front to the back and pulling it all the way through, or you could work across the front. I'm going to show working across the front here because I think that that's a very common way of stitching. I'm dipping my needle in and I'm coming out about a stitch width away I'm pulling through. You can also stack up more stitches than just one. You can do 2 or 3, whatever seems to work. Because I have so much collage here and I'm also working on top of stitching I've already done, it's working for me to take 1 stitch at a time. So there's my first line horizontally across the piece. And now I'm going to turn and go back in the other direction. I'm going to pick a distance that seems to make sense. I can always come back and place more stitches in between if I want my lines closer together. That's an option. I'm going to do the same thing I did in the other direction, and this is the way that I'm going to stitch across the entire piece. I could, of course, choose to do the upper area of this piece in horizontal stitches and turn and do vertical stitches in the bottom, and I often do that. But here, because I have some stitching in the background already, I think it's going to be nice to do horizontal stitching from the top to the bottom. So here I've worked to the top, and this would be a time where I could make a decision about changing my direction for the lower half and doing my stitches the other way. And depending on your collage, that might make a lot of sense and would look really nice. But like I said, I'm going to continue in this case with what I'm doing and continue this straight stitching horizontally all the way to the bottom. So here I've just completed my last row. I've done my straight stitching or my running stitch across the piece. You can see how it's unified this riot of color in a really interesting way, and it's starting to really come together. So now my last step is to add some final touches with straight stitch. I'm going to come in and add more texture and color. I'm going to use the straight stitch to stitch circles. I'm going to wrap my straight stitch around the edges, and I'm going to stitch simple straight lines to add subtle background texture. So here's my completed collage. I've stitched lines, I've stitched plus signs, I've wrapped my stitch around the edge, I've stitched circles, all with 1 stitch only. The straight stitch lends itself to so many different variations that you really don't have to know any fancy stitches to be able to create a beautiful slow stitched collage. Sometimes it's even nice to look at the back and enjoy the abstract designs that you've made there too. I hope this inspires you and gives you the courage to give slow stitching a try. One question that I'm often asked is what to do with the completed piece. I've linked in the description to a lot of projects that you can try if you want to make something out of your slow stitching. But for now, I want to encourage you to just dive in and make something without worrying about what it's going to be in the end. I think you're going to learn a lot and really enjoy the process. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, happy stitching.